Good evening. My name is George Cunningham, Chair of the UK Liberal Democrats Federal International Relations Subcommittee on China. May I welcome you all to the webinar, which tonight will be on President Xi's next 5 years. What should Europe's strategy be? The Federal International Relations Committee is pleased to be holding this event in association with Liberal International British Group, Liberal Democrat Europe Group, and Liberal Democrats Overseas. A special welcome to Chinese Lib Dems and to all others who are attending this event. I have great pleasure in welcoming on the panel, in the following order of speaking, Professor Kerry Brown, Director of the Lau Institute at King's College, renowned sinologist and author of several books on Chinese politics, including one on President Xi, A Study in Power. Lord Jeremy Purvis, Liberal Democrat spokesperson for Foreign Affairs, International Trade and International Development. Ms. Vera Cranenberg, Klingendahl Institute of International Relations. And Ms. Maya Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Friends, I recall back in 2014, the time I accompanied EU President Van Rompuy in a meeting with President Xi on his visit to Brussels. President Xi was on a familiarization tour, taking in many countries around the world, just having taken charge. Then, almost 10 years ago, we had great hopes that he would continue liberalizing Chinese economy and that the human rights situation might be improved in that great country. Alas, this has not proven to be the case. And so let's begin with my good friend Kerry Brown, with whom I've had the pleasure of working with at the EU, to assess what may be the geostrategic intentions of President Xi and how it might affect the UK and the rest of Europe in the next 5 years.
Well, thank you very much, George. I hope my connection is stable. I'm in a hotel in Oxford, so if it isn't stable, George, if you could tell me, as I don't want to be talking flamboyantly here and find that I'm talking to a void. So I wanted to just say three things. One is about people, policy, and program. So people, policy, and program are the three things. Xi Jinping's reappointment was no big surprise. And the people around him, I suppose the thing that I found most interesting was, where are the economists? And I'll come back to that in a second. Most analysis, I think, agrees that he has brought into the inner circle of the 7-strong standing committee a group of people who have pretty tangible links with him in their past working record. Li Qiang, who's the number 2 in the hierarchy now, therefore most likely going to be the premier and head of administration and the economy next March, the National People's Congress. Worked with Xi Jinping when he was in Zhejiang in the early 2000s as kind of his chief of staff in the system, and is now the party secretary of Shanghai and closely associated with the very harsh lockdowns there earlier this year. Cai Qi is current mayor of Beijing. He has a link with Xi Jinping going back to the late 90s in Fujian province, southeastern China. And then you have a kind of Li Xi, figure who worked with Xi Jinping's father, I believe, in the 1980s. And so this is kind of, sorry, let me put this on again. This is kind of, kind of group of people who've been elevated, who, have very tangible links with Xi. One figure who has continued in the Politburo from last time, who is extremely significant, is Wang Huning, who is the great ideologue of contemporary China. And he, I think, has given 2 big answers to questions that vex politics throughout the world. The first is that he has answered the question, who are we as Chinese? So I think his idea derived from the Xi era. And the second is that he has located power in culture. And that is very important to the Xi program, the fact that Chinese culture is a great source of cohesiveness while the rest of the world seems to be falling apart. And that, I think, is something that does have a big impact on domestic politics, so it's a geopolitical issue. Second, on program. I said, where are the economists? None of the figures in the Politburo are people with an economics portfolio. They have all really worked within the party in political jobs. And I say this because overwhelmingly, the challenges that the party is going to face and the country are economic at the moment. Housing market, where 70% of the wealth is kind of really afflicted by lack of confidence and liquidity. Unemployment is increasing. Growth was about 3.5%. It may go above 4, maybe to 5%, but it's still underwhelming in Chinese terms. There could be a recession. China in a recession is a place we don't know what it looks like because it hasn't been in a recession for many decades. And then finally, the issue of the impact of zero COVID laws, already worrying signs that Guangdong province may well be going into lockdown. That's kind of going to be a big impact because it's so important economically. Really kind of no real sign that this policy is going to be lifted. So how this group face the economic issues, this is going to be really important. And I don't see any clear sign at the moment that these are people who have ever operated in an economic way before. And that may be because they're going to have good advisors who will be appointed in the next few months, or maybe because they just don't care about the economy. That's a kind of scary thing. Very finally, program. Xi Jinping made a big report on the 16th of October, at the beginning of the Congress, and he talked about commitment to common prosperity. That means, I think, dealing with inequality, and the commitment to dual circulation that is off China's back by being less dependent on them. And I think the other thing that was really striking in this report was massive commitment to China as a research, development, and innovation power. And that, I think, is where I'm going to maybe conclude, because that's where things get real tricky for the outside world. It is clear politically that the outside world has huge issues with China and differences over values, politics, human rights in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, all of these issues. It is also pretty clear that working with China is unavoidable, however difficult people find it. And I guess the quandary that I'm sort of wrestling with, and it would be good to hear perspectives tonight, maybe, is China is putting in something like 6-7% of its GDP to research and development in areas that really matter: climate change, environment, things like this, life sciences, dealing with pandemics, believe it or not. That is going to be a big strategic choice, because either we work with China and Chinese partners in this more and more on their terms, or we don't. But we have to be aware that that choice, either way, has significant impact. And I think that shows how difficult this leadership are, because in many ways, while I can understand politically they create many problems, the issue is that they also are unavoidable partners for global issues. And I think that this leadership in particular kind of really makes clear some of the big strategic issues that we're going to have to wrestle with, because they do not provide easy answers about how to do that cooperation. Thank you very much.
Kerry, that was well delivered, thank you. Very stimulating. And you came across quite well. There was a bit of, jumping a little bit, but I think all your sentences came through entirely well. So I'm very grateful for that. So yes, quite a challenge. On the one hand, a declining economy, and of course very important for the whole world that the Chinese economy does well, because up to now we've relied on that for growth. Yet on the other hand, you have all that money going into research and innovation. How is that all going to equate? And therefore over to Jeremy Purvis for his view about where China might be going and what we might do about it. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, George. I found Kerry's analysis fascinating. I'm very sorry I can't be with you for the whole of the webinar, but thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the work, George, for you and colleagues have been doing to help support parliamentarians of trying to navigate some of the challenges that Kerry alluded to without predetermining where we should go. But he summed up, I think, quite neatly how UK, and as far as liberals within the UK, should be viewing what is a foreign policy balance sheet. And I wanted to maybe just give some reflections on what that balance sheet might look like as far as policymakers are concerned. and some of the real positives with our relationship with China and the opportunities that exist. But then obviously some of the challenges that we will need to address as far as the UK is concerned. And George, you're absolutely right, as far as the major impact on, it's not just economic development within China, but it's the impact of Chinese economic development on global development. And some of the advances that we have seen within the SDG period, for example, have been driven almost entirely by the developments within China itself. And therefore, as far as global development is concerned, China as a development arm has been quite remarkable. And the UK has benefited from some of that with regards to cultural advantage with our relationship. People to people relationship, I think, probably is stronger than in my lifetime. And we look at some of the joint learning, some of the travel, some of the human interaction with people to people has developed enormously. I live in Scotland, but when I'm in Westminster, I'm based down in Westminster, and just the human-to-human contact that you have with far more people from the whole breadth and diversity of China is very good. And as someone who believes in reducing barriers as much as possible and opening up people-to-people links, this has been a positive. There is also a self-interest as far as that's concerned, that those who are studying and visiting the UK are likely to be part of future leaders within China, whether they will reach the heights that Kerry had indicated, but nevertheless, across the breadth of China, there will be leaders who are spending some of their formative years within the UK now, and that is helpful for the UK. We have benefited in the past from having world leaders who have been to UK, studied in the UK, seen how an open, democratic, liberal society can function, and therefore it's a positive for me for that. I think it's also positive that our relationship with China is less about territorial aggression, obviously, that there are real pinch points within their wider neighbourhood, but it isn't a friction area for the UK per se, but I'll touch on some of the other elements within the challenges. There is obviously enormous opportunity for the UK as far as economic and research, and Kerry has indicated that the investments that China will be making, it is appropriate for the UK to consider what role we will play within that, what role we can play, what is appropriate, and what will also protect our interests. But it needs to be clear-eyed that they are the opportunities, as well as investment opportunities from the UK. So the positives on the balance sheet, I think, are very strong positives. However, the challenges that we have to address as legislators in Parliament and policymakers is how we frame what is a UK approach on, I think, in certain areas, a very differing view of what a rules-based international order might be. And they don't necessarily coincide. In some areas, of course, they do with partnership working, but it isn't necessarily on what taking a part of a rules-based order is concerned. I know that that's very Western. I know that that has its challenges with Africa and other parts of the world when we talk about a rules-based international order. But nevertheless, there's a differing approach for that. So if the UK, where the consensus that we have in the UK is for supporting that international order, it comes up against certain challenges when we are addressing many of the multilateral. Immediately before joining this webinar, I was on a separate webinar for Chatham House on listening to the Foreign Minister of Ghana giving a talk on what the new Commonwealth might be, and how a Commonwealth network from minuscule countries to countries the size of India, how a consensus network of 54 countries can operate on a multilateral basis to address some of the global challenges. And the Commonwealth one foreign minister of the Commonwealth had said to me in the past that the great advantage of the Commonwealth is that it has two great advantages. One, America is not a member of it, and the second is that China isn't a member of it. So the UK playing our role in building coalitions of willing on a consensus basis is to our strength, and that sometimes will come up against a more transactional view of the world from Beijing. And it means that when you have neutrality on some of the global transition from China, when the UK wants to be progressive and active, then there are some differences. And of course, here at home, some of our own internal security challenges and areas where we have to be very wary about, I think are been quite well rehearsed, and the UK approach on Hong Kong. I asked a question just yesterday about UK foreign policy and trade. We've seen trade decline with the EU. We've seen our trade deficit balloon in importing of goods with China. My view is that we are now strategically dependent in certain sectors for our economy on imports from China. I think that is a challenge to us when we see that our trade with the EU is declining because of barriers that have been erected. And I also think that our view of how global trade, global e-commerce, data, identity protection, intellectual property protection, working with others on common standards, on value systems, on mobility, on border areas. We should be a leader in the UK on global customary international law. This is also challenged. I just came back from Buenos Aires yesterday, where I was speaking at a conference of parliamentarians on rule of law issues and some of the challenges that exist within that. Ultimately, where does this lead us? Well, the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Select Committee published a report which had called the UK having a strategic void when it comes to our relationship with China. I think that I share many of the thoughts for that. And I've called for a strategic audit of our relationship with China to frame our next set of decisions as we go forward. If we believed George Osborne and David Cameron, we are now in year 7 of a golden decade of our relationship. When I watched Xi in the Royal Gallery in the House of Lords address both houses of Parliament, we're having to shift some of our thinking, and an audit of UK strategic interests with our relationship, I think, would be beneficial. I think that should be public, and it should be open and transparent, and we should be consulting so that the UK goes forward in an informed way, so that we can take advantage of the positives, but we also have much more of a clear strategic view of how we address some of the challenges. And I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful, wonderful, Jeremy. Thank you so much indeed. And most interesting, the balancing act that you've made there between the opportunities and challenges of working with and dealing with China, and in particular, the importance of having a strategic interests audit. And I will come back to you, or maybe one of the questions will be on the issue of the importance that you've placed, for instance, on people-to-people contacts, and how this whole zero COVID policy has put enormous barriers to that, between China and the rest of the world, and the impact that's been having. But anyway, to continue this fascinating discussion, may I turn to Vera Kranenberg, who is joining us from Klingendael in the Netherlands, to make sure that we are truly international. And I ask her kindly to give her comments, please.
Yes, great to be joining you all from The Hague tonight. I'm very glad actually that Professor Brown already highlighted that in the Party Congress work report, the importance of science and technology was very pronounced for the continued development of China. So I will focus mostly on the technology aspect. to move to Europe, basically the trend of the development that has been going on in Europe and the Netherlands is for sure an example of this, is to move the relationship with China towards one that is based on two basic principles, mostly protect where we must and cooperate where we can, very simply said. And it means that there's a lot of focus now on economic security and on strategic dependencies. I think this dependencies debate really gained attention during the pandemic, of course, when suddenly there were no face masks to be found anywhere. And clearly, with the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the dependence on Russian gas, this has only become more important. What we see, for example, in the Netherlands, we've had a few cases where the Dutch government has actually intervened in order to make sure that companies that have advanced technologies would not be taken over by Chinese investors. So in 2020, this happened twice, actually, once with a shipbuilding company and once with an integrated photonics company. So this is also a high-tech area. And so we see that with the high-tech question, it's about strategic dependencies, yes, but it's also about the unwanted technology transfer. That's the other big issue that Europe is dealing with in its relations with China on this front. Because the Chinese government's tech policies, they lead to risks for Europe. And in certain high-tech areas, such as semiconductors, the strategic dependency on China is not the main concern, but the technology transfer is one of the main concerns. Of course, there are several ways to gain access to technological knowledge, and acquiring companies or acquiring a stake in companies is one of those. And as was mentioned before, EU member states, they have, of course, export controls, and many are working on investment screening mechanisms. So there is a lot happening, but those mechanisms, of course, do not cover all areas to acquire sensitive technology. And one example of that is that me and my colleagues researched was on European-Chinese joint ventures in China that exist in all the focus technology areas that the Chinese government laid out in Made in China 2025. Sometimes those joint ventures include Chinese state-owned enterprises, and sometimes they even declare themselves that one of their main objectives is technology transfer. So this is an issue that European governments need to look into. Yeah, those risks, of course, they can never be decreased, or they can never be eliminated, but they can be decreased to a certain extent. And at the same time, European companies and European states have large commercial and scientific interest to continue technological cooperation with China. And ending it would, of course, harm innovation capacity and the international economic position of these countries. So besides access to the Chinese market, access to Chinese knowledge and talent is also increasingly relevant. So therefore, what Europe and European states need to do beyond the broad protection where it's needed and cooperation where it's possible is also decide which risks are acceptable and to which extent when there are large interests at stake, and decide which interests need to be prioritized even when there are large risks involved. Important also point to highlight, and it was highlighted recently with the latest US export controls on Chinese semiconductor companies, is that the challenge for Europe is not just coming from China, but also from US competition with China and the need for European states to maneuver between the great powers. It was reported, for example, a few days ago that the US would start negotiations with the Netherlands and with Japan in order to convince them to adopt similar export controls that the US has started themselves. And that's just one example of a pressure coming from heightened competition between the two powers, and it has direct consequences for the interests of European states. But the last point that I would like to end with is that I've so far talked about the protect where we must part of the principle, but of course, there is also the cooperate where we can principle. And I think recently global crises have also highlighted that Europe should not just cooperate where we can, but also cooperate where we must. And what I mean is that there are areas where non-cooperation can be much more costly than cooperation is. And the obvious examples are, of course, global health, and the pandemic preparedness is an example of that, and also certain areas of combating climate change.
Have you completed your
Yes.
presentation, Fran? Okay, it's a very sudden ending. Thank you so much. But that's really very, very interesting, and it's a very, very. We're really at this webinar highlighting perhaps what is the crux of some of the coming issues. And I'd just like to say that, of course, it's a lot to do with reciprocity as well. There's been a lot of cooperation in the past, for instance, on the Horizon program, Horizon Europe program. In which the Huawei, in fact, rather more than China itself, have been participating in that and gaining intellectual property, knowledge from it, and indeed copyrighting their outcomes. So a lot of it, of course, is to do with the issue of reciprocity, and somehow we're having a mechanism that if we have partnerships, there is reciprocity, and both sides are gaining from it. That's what I say. The other thing I would say is that, of course, we haven't mentioned Taiwan because, of course, we have not been talking on specific strategic issues when it comes to security issues. We perhaps under Mia we will. But Taiwan is, of course, the first and foremost semiconductor producer in the world. And one of the things Europe should really be trying to do is to encourage Taiwan's investment and involvement as much as possible in Europe as a like-minded place to work with. Anyway, just some further remarks. And last but not least, as I keep on saying, the great Mayor Nowens, who I was involved in the past in terms of activities concerning, I think with Kerry as well, concerning research. So welcome back, Mia, and over to you for your remarks, please.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to follow on such great presentations. Look, as my title suggests, look at security and defense more broadly when it comes to China. So I'm going to focus my remarks on that and a little bit on my takeaways from the 20th Party Congress and what that means for us. I think my first takeaway is that from the Party Congress work report, I thought the focus on the international environment no longer being firmly in China's favor was a really interesting, different tone that was not the case in 2017 when we saw the last Party Congress. I mean, this, from my perspective, was really all about preparing the Chinese population for a struggle with when it comes to economic growth or lack thereof, struggle when it comes to social inequality, struggle when it comes to international relations as well. And though the US was never once mentioned by name in the report, it was certainly not omitted from the report in sentiment. I thought it was interesting that this was reflected in this way. To me, that raises the question of whether there is finally an acceptance or a resignation in the CCP, and perhaps by see that some of its domestic policies and activity abroad have not been well received over the last 4 years, I would say, whether that be Xinjiang, whether that be COVID policies, wolf warrior diplomacy, so forth and so forth. And I suppose in addition to that, the rather disastrous, from a PR perspective, war in Ukraine and China's policy on that may, I suppose, also have added to some of that burden. In terms of how the People's Liberation Army, which is the armed wing of the party, the military of the party in China, was mentioned in the work report, I thought two things were interesting. First of all, that PLA development continues to be a work in progress. That was very clear in the work report. This is not a military that is near to achieving some of the goals that President Xi has set forth. And the two that are most upcoming are the firstly, party building and army building military goal of 2027 and the full modernization goal by which the PLA needs to be a modern military by all accounts by 2035. And this counts for everything from defense, weapons, and platforms development, with a particular mention of informatization, integration of smart technologies into the military, as well as nuclear capabilities and deterrence, which are a little bit new in terms of the language and the focus. Also touching on the importance of development of personnel within the PLA, the people of the PLA, through exercises, training, and educational reforms. And lastly, of course, as was mentioned already multiple times, science and technological innovation and R&D that has military application. There is a clear security element to this, as we've already noted. And I would add that in addition to where we compete and where we collaborate, we also really need to keep in mind that in some of these areas of technology, even when we don't think there's a clear military application, there is somewhere down the line, there could be a military application. So I'm not a technologist. Some of these things sound very vague and abstract to me. But if you look at what they actually are and what they do, there can be military applications. And as the US becomes increasingly restrictive on the engagement between US and Chinese technological science and technological communities, Europe and the UK are going to continue to, I think, be targets for some of this tech transfer, whether illegal or fully legal, depending on our national systems. And we've already seen that happen and reported in the UK, for example. They report that some former RAF pilots actually went to China and helped upskill the PLA, not just in terms of weapons or platforms capabilities, but also in terms of understanding tactics, NATO tactics, and capabilities as well. So secondly, in terms of Taiwan, from my reading of the report and from Xi's speech, there does not seem to be an urgent threat of a full-scale cross-strait conflict just yet. As I said, PLA modernization is ongoing, and this is a very important goal for Xi and the CCP to achieve. So this isn't something that's just going to be done on a whim where there might be a chance of success. I think the risk calculus has not changed from the PLA and from the CCP's perspective, even following Ukraine. The 2027 goal was interesting because it was, with regards to Taiwan, I think, clarified a little bit. I think this is a capability-related goal so that the PLA by 2027 has options for a Taiwan contingency, but it is not a sped-up timeline for modernization, as was previously reported in Western news media, nor is it a political intent timeline for a Taiwan contingency. So military capability does not equate political will, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. I think the two are sometimes conflated in media. The work report, I think, did not include a lot of new language on Taiwan. The only two things I would mention that I found interesting were that the threat to Taiwan, or rather the cause of instability around Taiwan, was directed purely at two elements: foreign interference and a few separatists, rather than, the entire DPP party. And second of all, that any ire from Beijing or threats of the use of force for forced reunification were not directed at the Taiwanese population. And I think that was underlined twice, which is an interesting almost parallel of how the US has started talking about China, that this is directed, any criticism is directed at the CCP and not the Chinese population. I found that interesting. What that means for me is that in the near term future, what we'll see most likely is increased gray zone activity, however you would like to define that, around Taiwan, that will increase. We've certainly seen that already increase post Pelosi and the exercises that the PLA conducted around Taiwan. And certainly the US seems to be incredibly concerned around the date of 2024 at the moment. Other than the main military reporting or Taiwan-related reporting in the Party Congress work report, I think two other points are interesting. First of all, that the BRI is a power projection tool seems to be downgraded a little bit, and there instead the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative seem to be follow-on successors to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think China is going to be acting less in the infrastructure space and more in the norms and values and governance space, more globally, and particularly in the developing world. I also think that we need to broaden our understanding of how China views security. Security nearly tripled in number of mentions in the Party Congress work report compared to, for example, the same number of mentions of economy. And so security and China's view of security is something that we need to understand more, not just what that means at home, but also what the extraterritoriality is of that security concept. And certainly in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, in recent weeks, we've seen some of that security focus come to the fore in news media, particularly in the UK, most recently in terms of the attacks on Hong Kong protesters outside of the Chinese consulate in Manchester, and also the reporting of, in the UK and elsewhere in Europe and in the world actually, covert and unlawful Chinese overseas police stations that have been linked to the repression of either dissidents or Chinese overseas Chinese citizens who may or may not be critical of the Chinese government. So what does this mean for us? Well, in total, I think Chinese activity globally in this space is not going to decrease in the next few years. But what I do wonder is to what extent Xi, as an actor, the CCP as an actor, the PLA as an actor in the next 5 years are either going to be moving more towards becoming risk averse or risk tolerant. I think the more that we have come to terms with China as an actor and talk about China as an actor, the more that has almost had a cyclical effect to, again, heightened threat perceptions in Beijing, as well, as we saw mentioned and reflected in that work report. So what does that heightened threat perception mean for China as an actor moving forward? And also, as Xi has surrounded himself by loyalists, what does that mean for the information flow that this top leader who decides on almost everything in China is getting? And what does that mean for decision making in China on very important policies? For Europe and for the UK in particular, as I think I'm speaking to a UK audience here, I think we need to be a lot clearer on what our China policy is at home. I think there's still a lot of homework to be done on our China policies, which in my mind remain broadly undefined. What do we find acceptable? What do we not find acceptable? And where do we engage and where do we think competition is needed? Secondly, how do we align ourselves or not more clearly with like-minded countries in our own region, but also in the Indo-Pacific, where some of our partners and allies are facing increased assertiveness from China? And lastly, how do we become more engaged with countries in which China is seeking to gain influence and leverage that influence on in various ways, where we have largely been disengaged in the last few years? I know that we've come up with various counter BRI initiatives. Those have all amounted to pretty much nothing in the last few years, if we're very honest with ourselves. And they've just gone through multiple relabeling exercises. So what is it that we're actually offering to countries that seek engagement or perhaps alternatives to China? Do we need to provide an alternative like for like in all areas of the Belt and Road Initiative? Probably not, because we simply can't. So then what's left for us to do, and where can we leverage our strengths and work with countries to actually understand what they need and how we can be of service and help? And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Mia. That was magnificent, a fantastic sweep across the geostrategic. And I was going to say that Jeremy, who's stayed on valiantly, can I ask him just to respond to that question on how you're going to conduct the strategic interests audits, which came up? I think you typed an answer. Perhaps people would like to hear it as well. Thank you.
George, I'm very sorry I am having to dash, but the answer that I gave to Claire was giving an indication of perhaps what a way forward might be through the UK National Security Council. I've raised questions about the uncertainty as its status at the moment, but nevertheless, the government has indicated that the strategic defense review will need to be reviewed anyway in the context of Ukraine. But given the current UK economic climate, plus also the situation with Ukraine, this really is the time for us to fill the void that had been highlighted in the lack of a strategy for China. And it shouldn't be an FCDO DoD led. It should be a whole government review, which brings in the business department, Department for International Trade, also development expertise, because I think that it is an important, and one thing that's not been, well, it's been alluded to, but it's very important for my mind, is that there's a void that the UK is also creating with our foreign policy, which I'm concerned about, certainly with African partners, but other countries. We are sending mixed signals as far as being a development partner or an investment partner and a trading partner. And when we create mixed signals and we leave from certain areas as development partners, then voids will be filled by others. So I think that a whole government review, I think that it should also be presented to Parliament. Of course, government has the responsibility at an executive level, but I think these are so significant issues going forward, then Parliament needs to debate it and in effect endorse this approach, because it should frame our wider foreign and development policy as well as our trade and broadcasting, and the points that Vera had mentioned, whether the UK should have its own Chips Act, whether we have a different set of policy frameworks for our universities that frames their partnership. We've highlighted the need for reciprocity in research and development, for intellectual property, the whole suite. We could have an entire hour talking about the list of all the different areas, but that should be in the wide, that is a key pillar in the overall wider strategy that should exist, and I've been pressing for that roadmap to try and bring that about. And on that point, I'm afraid I do have to dash. I hope that that's not going to be utterly condemned in my absence.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you for giving us even extra time than the extra time that we asked you for. Cheerio.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for Mila and Kerry and Vera. That's absolutely fascinating. And thank you, George, for facilitating and bringing together. Thank you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we have to rock and roll. We've got 2 questions in so far, so please feel free to ask questions. We have 20 minutes left. First question is from, I'm taking it in the order of being asked, it's from Peter Cummings, who says, I'm currently reading Nathan Law's book on freedom, How We Lose It and How We Fight Back. Have any of the presenters read this book? And would they like to comment on its assessment and its warnings about the behavior and attitudes of the PRC-CCP? And how far should the experiences of Hong Kongers with mainland China potentially influence our longer-term approach to the meaning and nature of democracy in China, where the rule of law appears to be replaced with the rule by law? And therefore, I turn with this intrepid question to Kerry to start with, if you could be kind enough. So how much should we be concerned about this and draw lessons from treatment of Hong Kongers?
Great. Well, I'm afraid I haven't read Nathan Law's book. I do apologize. I think I'll probably say something that won't be terribly popular. The issue of Hong Kong and China's moral and other right over complete control and sovereignty of Hong Kong was kind of resolved in 1997, or even before that, probably in the negotiations between Britain and Britain and China for Hong Kong and its state. And I think in the minds of Xi Jinping and his colleagues, it's really their show now, and only a complete economic collapse in Hong Kong may have changed their tack, and that's not happened so far. In fact, I think that they feel now that this is an issue that they have the absolute right to deal with as they would like. We have to remember, for them, Hong Kong's a tiny part of their economy these days, and only a small group of people. It's always been the case, I suppose, that give disproportionate attention in the outside world to kind of particular groups in China and think that they are important. And I'm not saying that they're not important, but we have to remember that the Xi leadership is a nationalist and populist one, much as the leadership in America may well soon be nationalist and populist. And I mean, I'm sure we're dicing with that here in Britain too. And therefore, the people that matter to Xi Jinping, the billion or so people who form his base, they're not necessarily the people who went into lockdown in Shanghai or elsewhere who have been extremely unhappy. I'm not saying that there aren't 300 or 400 million very unhappy people in China, but they are not the people that Xi Jinping needs to support, believe, and be devoted to him. That's the sort of brute reality of politics in China. Now, a severe economic downturn might change that. That's true. As I say, a China recession is not a place we really know. It kind of happened maybe in 88, 89, ended in the Tiananmen Square uprising. So a recession in China does not have good outcomes for the party. But I mean, we haven't got to that place yet. And finally, on these issues of how do we support democracy in China, or how do we support developments in China? I mean, all I will say is that we could probably try and live up to our ideals better outside of China. One of the biggest reasons that I think we have the kind of leadership that we see with Xi Jinping is a sort of response to the outside world. First, to the 2008 great economic crisis, I think is one of the drivers of the Xi politics, and that's not about Xi Jinping as an individual. It's about an ethos, a nationalistic attitude, and commitment to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. All of these grand narratives that I think really explain his leadership with a capital L, the kind of structure of his leadership. It's not about him as a person. It's really about a kind of structural politics. I think the second thing is that things have happened in America in particular, but also in Europe and elsewhere, have created a sense that, in Chinese eyes at least, we're unstable, we're divided, we don't really live up to our own kind of standards, we say one thing and do another thing, and I think that that has had a big impact in Chinese domestic politics. It is not our responsibility, Chinese domestic politics, but it is one of the explanatory reasons for why we see a much more muscular, nationalistic, self-reliant kind of pushy Chinese leadership, because they think we are not very reliable or stable, and they don't want to take kind of any more responsibility for our behavior. So I guess that's, as far as I can see, an unpalatable kind of fact, but it's a fact we have to accept.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kerry. Moving on now, I guess this is for Mia primarily, on Taiwan. We have two questions. One is, do speakers think that Taiwanese can sleep more easily in their beds, that the threat from China has diminished? Has China really learned lessons from the war in Ukraine and the unified response by the West to Russia's aggression? And also Chris Young says, should the Western world fully prepare for a global war with C4 defending Taiwan? So it's very important, actually, to what degree, and we haven't really touched upon this because everything is such a vast subject with China, so we can't touch upon everything. But how has Ukraine sort of impacted on everybody's thinking towards each other? And how does that impact on Taiwan? And we start with Mia on that one, please.
Sure. So in terms of whether or not Taiwanese can sleep more easily in their beds because the threat from China has diminished, I mean, I don't really see the threat from China having diminished. What I said and hopefully made clear in my presentation is that I don't think we can say one way or another that it has diminished or it has increased, because we simply don't know what President Xi Jinping thinks on this. And the only person, bar Taiwan making two very serious moves towards unification or capability acquisition that are considered the red lines, which border on the nuclear, this decision is going to be taken by President Xi Jinping or whoever leads China at the time of a Taiwan contingency. So I just want to make that clear, that nobody can say for certain whether a timeline has sped up or has not, or has been pushed back for Taiwan. And what I can say is that having visited Taiwan recently, on the ground, the average population does not seem more panicked than they would have been the last time that I visited a few years ago, pre-Pelosi and pre-Chinese Party Congress, and pre-deteriorating even greater relations between the US and China. So life in Taiwan goes on for the average Taiwanese. The government, of course, is dealing with a different situation with increased presence of the PLA around Taiwan on a near daily basis, crossing the Taiwan Strait median line on a near daily basis, with a greater set of capabilities as well in the mix. So whilst they might not think that a full Taiwan invasion is likely tomorrow, there is a great amount, I think, of effort being put in place for preparation to try and deter that, not alone, of course, but with allies and partners, the United States foremostly, but also in discussion, of course, the US in discussion with countries like the UK on what European roles might be in the event of a Taiwan contingency, whatever that might look like. I think we also have to move away from the fact that this is either the worst case scenario of a full-scale invasion or nothing at all. There's a whole space and an escalation, a number of escalatory actions that could take place below the threshold of conflict. So we also need to keep that in mind. Taiwanese, though, the government now, I think, is learning from Ukraine that a couple of lessons, as the PLA will be learning lessons from what's happening in Ukraine. From the Taiwanese perspective, the importance of civil defense being something that they undertake more seriously in the near future is a key lesson, and that's not something that Taiwan can do alone. But it is, of course, looking at how civil defense has been important in Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion. Here, a lot of work needs to be done on the status of the reserve forces and also in terms of conscription in Taiwan, which both have, for political reasons, been woefully invested in. Secondly, perhaps a more negative lesson or more disheartening lesson is that in Taiwan or in a Taiwan contingency, a full-scale invasion contingency or a joint aerial strike contingency, there is going to be very little time for a refugee evacuation. So that means that everybody on Taiwan is going to be involved in a Taiwan contingency, whether they like it or not. And we can then question what that means for a will to fight at the end of the day as well, if that civil defense preparation is not increased more seriously and substantially. Lastly, from the Taiwanese perspective, looking at Ukraine, Ukraine has, of course, benefited from a land border, which Taiwan will not have. So resupply of Taiwan is going to be incredibly difficult, even for the United States in the time of a contingency. And so Taiwan needs to think more seriously about stockpiling certain capabilities in order to hold off a full-scale invasion as long as it can and wait for allied assistance. From the PLA's perspective, lots of lessons have been learned. Again, I think the PLA will not have expected the Russians to perform as badly and as poorly as they've done so far. There's important lessons on the vitality of information dominance, control and communications networks, the role of space and cyber in a conflict, the utility of an early threat of use of nuclear force early on in a conflict, whether that will be followed on with or not. The importance of aerial dominance and air superiority, so on and so forth. So there's lots of lessons to be learned. Some of those are positive, some of those are negative. By and large, I would say the PLA has been preparing for Taiwan contingency as its main mission for the last 20 odd years. And so this isn't really greatly changing anything all too much. And in terms of another lesson that's non-military but equally important, I think, from Beijing's perspective, is that the West has been able to respond to the war in Ukraine in a unified way, both politically and economically speaking, and not just from a governmental approach, but also with private sector involvement, aligning with that governmental approach in terms of sanctions or export controls on Russia and cutting business ties quite quickly. That for Beijing, I think, will have been a surprise. But on the other hand, they will be watching very closely how long this strong response lasts. And so how much and how long they will have to endure pain in the event of a Taiwan contingency is something that I think is going to be a consideration for them. And lastly, in terms of the question of should the Western world fully prepare for a global war with Xi for defending Taiwan, look, I think that's to a certain extent already ongoing. The US, I think, is most involved in this. Japan is very involved in this as well. So not just a Europe or transatlantic discussion, but also one very much being considered in the Indo-Pacific by certain actors. But here in Europe, I think we're very, very early on in the discussion with regards to what a European role in the event of a Taiwan contingency could actually be.
It was excellent. Thank you very much. Very comprehensive, speedily spoken. I'm going to turn now, of course, to Vera, because we cannot leave anyone untouched with questions. And I have a question from actually a former EU ambassador who's been retired for a while, my good friend Frans Jessen. And he says, could you say a few words about how you see the current EU policy towards China? And it seems to be up your street, Vera. How do you see the current EU policy towards China, rather generally?
Okay, yeah. So I'll keep it very general. Then, of course, in 2019, the EU presented a paper where they stated that they see China as a partner, an economic competitor, and a strategic rival. So in 3 ways at the same time. I do think recently, at least in discussions, been focused a bit more on those last 2, the competitor and the rival parts, than on the partner. What I think is, broadly, one important thing that happened, of course, is the Chinese sanctions on EU politicians and the response to that being that the comprehensive agreement on investment is basically frozen now for the foreseeable future, and we won't see anything happen in that space, which was an area where there was still partnership going on, I think we can say. And of course, the complicating issue for the EU always is that we need consensus when it comes to a foreign policy, and that Hungary is often more pro-China than other member states, and this complicates issues. And I think that what is very interesting about EU policy towards China, and a good thing also, is that in comparison to US policy in China, the EU finds it more important to be country neutral when it comes to big changes. So when we think about export controls, they want country neutral export controls that go for the whole world, and they single out China less so than in what is happening in the United States, I think, if we compare these two. So yeah, that's very broadly speaking a couple of remarks.
Excellent. Okay. We've got another 4 or 5 minutes left. So I'm going to take the last two questions I've got here sort of together, because they're both to do with China's role in the multilateral area. So Wendy Kyle Pope says, or asked, I should say, how committed is China to reducing global warming, given that it is determined to protect its economy? And I link it to Hannah Betsworth's question: how would we go about developing a global health system that effectively encourages openness and transparency without focus on apportionment of blame? And then she says, I wonder if aviation works as a model here. So how are we dealing with, how does China and Europe interact concerning global warming and also health after everything that we have experienced and are experiencing now? And I turn my attention to, for the second time around, maybe to all of you to say a few words on it. Kerry first. Kerry, global warming and health. How should we be dealing with China?
Thank you. Well, I mean, thanks for inviting me for this discussion. I've enjoyed it, and thank you, George, for facilitating it. So on climate change, or on the sort of global issues, I think Toby Ord, who is the, I believe, professor of the future at Oxford, which must be the world's coolest job. He has written a book called The Precipice, I think, which is about, I think it's called The Precipice, about existential issues, you know, I mean, issues that are really going to impact on humanity, which climate change, big media, pandemic, you know, kind of artificial intelligence, all of these things are mentioned. And all of those things, China, I think, is more of an ally than a kind of opponent. So, and I guess that's the good news. The second is that with the centralization of power in Beijing under Xi Jinping, I mean, at least it means that there is a man with whom we can do a deal, you know, rather than any kind of sort of more complicated setup. And that shouldn't be forgotten. A highly centralized autocratic China is one problem. It's probably more of a problem to have a, you know, kind of messy, unstable, and kind of fragmented China. And the third thing is that Xi Jinping, since his time in Zhejiang in 2002 onwards, has been quite a vocal environmentalist and is surrounded by people who are committed to that program. And that was also mentioned in the work report, the government report, or whatever you call it, that was given on the 16th of October. And I mean, that's really important. It means a really significant partner is, you know, not kind of doubting that climate change is a huge issue. The final thing I'll say is that it's really a case of speed and scale, though. I mean, China's commitments, as I understand them, are, you know, all good and fine, but they're really too leisurely. And China's kind of addiction to fossil, you know, fuels, that's also, you know, kind of very severe. And so it's really a question of, can it do things as quickly as the world needs? And, you know, kind of, will it be able to create technologies that could be helpful? I mean, we've got to be optimistic. I think it's putting so much resources into this that I'm sure it'll come up with some solutions. The question is the nature of partnership that the world outside wants as it does these things. And that's very important to remember. We cannot solve them without China. We either solve them with China or we don't solve them at all.
Yeah, that's right. We're all beholden to each other. But in particular, I suppose if you see all those dry riverbeds next to mega cities, you start realizing that huge problems are arriving on China's doorstep in terms of, you know, water provision and things like that. And so therefore, it's really essential they are seeing more and more in terms of, you know, their own social stability, the need to act on climate change and environmental issues. That's just my little comment. Vera, do you want to say a last few words, and then Mia on this, and then we'll we'll pack up the show. We've covered all the questions, actually, on climate change and on health.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in either of these areas, but I would say that I completely agree with that point that you just made on how for China there's clear domestic reasons also to act on climate change, and that of course helps in combating global climate change. And that we've seen in BRI there's been some attempt to green it or to not fund coal plants abroad anymore, so there is some development in that area. And then for global health, yeah, I would say that what is a positive thing is that China is also supporting the pandemic fund, which was basically created over the last year, and it's under the World Bank, so that which generally has, of course, the image of being a US-dominated institution. So that I think is a positive thing that we should celebrate.
Thanks, Vera. Mia, the final word.
Oh, well, that's a lot of responsibility, the final word. Look, these likewise are not areas that I work on, but just on the point of the BRI, yes, no new coal plants have been opened globally, so China seems to be sticking to its word there. On the other hand, some of the other green energy projects that China has been pursuing globally along the BRI, such as hydroelectric dams, are incredibly not environmentally friendly, let's just say. So in that sense, I think coming to a greater understanding of where we can work together in some of these green areas that are truly green and not just green by label because they're not fossil fuels might be something that we should look into more globally. Of course, the second thing on climate change that we're going to be facing is a crunch for greener technology in Europe, specifically following the war in Ukraine and our diversification of energy imports. On the other hand, of course, China is one of the main producers of some of those technologies. So how we maintain those ties might be something, of course, of great importance as well.
Good, thank you very much indeed. So therefore, I'm finishing up now. Rob wants to say a few words before I say my last 30 seconds worth. Do you have anything you want to say, Rob?
No, thank you very much indeed for the speaks. I just was coming to say, to remind people that we will have recorded this webinar. So if anyone wants to have a copy, please contact George at a later stage. And if anybody requires any deletions, then please feel free to let us know about it. It's been a pleasure to co-host this with George on behalf of the Liberal Democrat European Group, and we look forward to hosting further joint seminars with the Liberal Democrats abroad, as well as the Liberal International British Group and the Federal International Relations Committee.
Good. And so therefore, it just falls upon me to thank you all, to say that I think the Federal International Relations Committee will be back in touch with some of the participants here to assist us in further development work concerning our policy towards China. And I'm sure that also that Jeremy Purvis, who I also wish to thank formally here, I'm sure he will have great need of your expertise in the work that he's doing as well. So it's really nice for everybody to get together and meet each other. I thank the audience as well, and thank you for the questions, and I wish you a very, very nice evening. Cheerio.